and share my screen. All right. So as I mentioned, this is our second to last week. It's probably flown by for you. I know it has for me. This week, we're going to look entirely about training. We're going to train a StyleGAN model. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just, so we'll start with just like some lecture on just how GANs work. So you might have heard me referring to things like StyleGAN, big GAN. For whatever reason, the nomenclature has become that you like add a thing in front of GAN and then that's what model you're making. So I'll explain a little bit about how GANs work and particularly about StyleGAN and talk a little bit about how we're going to train, how we're going to do some training inside Runway and some things to look out for. So we'll just do a lecture, then we'll take a little break, and then I'll just do like a whole walkthrough of sort of how I set up trainings when I do stuff in Runway. So I did one last night on the Bone data set. So I finally did it. It turned out pretty cool actually. So I'll share that in a minute. And then we'll also look at how to do exports. So we'll look at how to export images as well as how to export these sort of random light and walks. So I'll show you how to do that stuff all directly inside Runway. And then next week, we're going to look at how to actually use a thing called P5JS, which is JavaScript, manipulating numbers, shapes, other things. We'll look at how to do that and have that talk to Runway. And I think I'll also look at how to do hosted models next week. So if you find that you've made a really fun, cool model and you want to build like a website out of that, Runway just recently offered a thing that they called hosted models, which basically allows you to host a model at a fixed interface or like IP address. So you could build like a front end URL that would then like make a website that could then talk to it. And it doesn't charge you like every minute that your like website is up, it charges like per request. So basically if you wanted to build a little website to generate random images from your models, you could do that and it wouldn't like break the bank essentially, which a lot of these sort of like the traditional way you would do this would be to set up a GPU that just sits around in the back end and it would get really expensive. So we'll look at that next week. So next week will be a little bit more of just like, cool, now that we've like made these models and done some things, we'll look at how to interact with them in various places. And I find that like people are generally interested in building like a website or something to sort of display those images. So we'll look at that next week. Before we jump into GANs, does anyone want to share some of the data sets they worked on over the past week or two? Or does anyone want to like have questions about data sets, other things?
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
It's kind of regarding using Python, and this might just be me never having used any kind of Python before. And maybe this is something we could do on a one-on-one, but it was more about the, like, let's say like in following along with the class notes and following along with like the other videos you have on YouTube, and you're installed your tool set and you've installed, you know, the Instagram scrapers and you've done these things. Once you've like installed them, every time you open Python, do you need to do that again? Is there a quicker way to do that? Like, is it, and then also, how do you go about creating new folders and not having to reinstall the tool set each time, kind of thing?
Cool. Yeah, that's a great question.
Does that make sense?
I'm happy to, yeah, I'm happy to walk through that right now, actually. Let me share my screen and I can sort of show how I utilize stuff. So first off, you'll always see there's like 10 terminal windows open at any one time on my desktop. So essentially the way that this works is, so if you're familiar with the first step of this was to install Anaconda, right? So Anaconda is, what it does is essentially, it's what's called an environment manager. It manages little, like basically like what I do is for every project I run, I set up a little environment. That is the code that I like install, those sort of things. So basically once you've created that little environment, like I know there is, so there's like Instagram scraper, right? Every time that I need to run Instagram scraper now, I just use this command, which is conda activate Instagram scraper. That is just all of the installation materials I need for this. So basically anytime I open up a new terminal window, like usually the first thing I'll do is I'll just type in conda activate to activate whatever environment I have. So I've got one of these set up for Instagram scraper. I've got one of these set up for, I believe, data set tools. Let's see if this actually is true. Yep, so I've got one of these set up. So each one of these I will basically log into like these environments and have them set up. So those should be pretty much, you almost never have to update those. If you do, that means the library is updated and that means something bigger is going on. But you pretty much almost never have to update those. In terms of the folders, which is the next question. So usually my structure is I just have a folder of things called repos. These are all different GitHub tools. So usually what I will do is this is just a folder that sits in like, I think my home index. And then as I bring down these tools, I just install them into this folder. So I always have a folder where like all this stuff lives. And you'll see I've got way more tools in here than probably you do. But essentially then what you need to do for dataset tools is you just want to make sure that you always move to that folder when you start. So the simplest way to do this is just to click on the folder and then just hit Command C if you're on a Mac. That just copies the path. So then when you come back to the terminal, if you type CD, CD is always change directory. So that means go to whatever directory you're using or whatever directory you want to use. Then all you have to do is hit Command V, and that just pastes the direction. So like this is obviously where mine lives. Yours will probably live in a different place. So basically, if you do that, those are the steps just to get started. Once that's set up, like you're pretty much always ready to go. Now, every once in a while, I might tell you that you need to like update your repository or whatever. The way to do that is just type in git pull. I actually don't think I have anything new in here, but usually if I like push updates or new code to this, you'll just do that, and that just updates the repository. That's pretty much all you need to do. Once you have the environment set up, and then once you're in the right folder, then you can just run those commands over and over again. So you shouldn't have to like do a whole lot of setup every time to run this. The key is to make sure like because I'm in dataset tools, if I try to run Instagram scraper, I should get an error, and that's probably because I don't have the right things installed. Yeah, so you'll see I get a command not found. That's because I haven't installed the tools for this. Excuse me. Now this is partly because I do a lot of work in this. So there's different environments for all the different tool sets I have. If you find just like, I just need to have one that like sort of doesn't break, you could just set up one that is just like dataset tools. And then if you install the tool you need into it, you can like, this works fine. Like other people will have just like a big environment that installs a bunch of tools. I tend to break it down into really small things just in case things break. But that should get you like most of the way there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
I like ran into like my Instagram scraper crashed for some reason, and I couldn't understand what was going on. And then I wasn't sure if I had to load everything again, but I did get a ton of images. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and sometimes Instagram scraper will crash. A lot of times what'll happen is if you request too many images at once, like say you say your max like 10,000, at some point Instagram may just refuse your connection and you have to start it over again. So that does happen. It's because Instagram scraper actually uses Beautiful Soup, which is the thing I was showing how to use with Matthew's chart and patterns, and it runs into the same issue. If you request images like too many times, that like the server will basically just reject your request after a while. Yeah, so this is generally what I'll do, and usually, hopefully, like I'm getting better at this with all of my videos, that I will sort of like start by opening up the Conda window or like showing you how to install that stuff first. But that should be pretty reliable. If not, you're always welcome to ask me, and I can help hook things up.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? All right. So I know, so I know, Judd, you just shared some images that you're working on. Is it cool if we walk through them and you talk about them a little bit?
Totally. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let me share my screen and you can just sort of explain what you're working on.
Oh yeah, that works great. I was just interested in looking at some like simple shapes and patterns. And Matisse is obviously like a very interesting one to go for. And so I scraped a bunch of the stuff off Pinterest, just searching like Matisse tags and things like that, and kind of like going down a rabbit hole of recommendations. Right now, they are completely uncurated. So I think a lot needs to get removed. And I still don't even think this is enough items. to go off of. But I was just interested in like basically the hard edges, the abstractness of it. So there would be a lot of interesting, funky results that come out of it. Gosh, I was going to say something else about it, but I'm not sure. But I'd be curious to hear from you, Derek, like things that I should look out for. Obviously, not all of these fit, so I'd like to kind of cull some out. And then even things like images with text on top of them. I think I remember seeing you on Twitter actually talking about removing text from images to keep things focused. And even just like the mass cropping, like I don't mind doing it manually, honestly, because I did all this while watching Netflix and it was a great activity. So, but I'd be curious to hear like if you have recommendations on how you would go about cropping these, how you would go about like which, if you could like even just look at a couple of these and be like, oh yeah, I would mix this, this, and this. That would be like
Cool.
helpful information.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think this is a great start to a data set. And it's like obviously some really interesting stuff. I think you clearly see like there's a color palette and then like a texture or like a shape style to a lot of this, which makes a lot of sense. Like clearly you'll want to like curate out stuff that looks like maybe more like this, which has like more of that gradient pattern. But I think like, I think what's also cool about Pinterest, because it has that visual similarity tools, you could probably start to find more and more from those sets. So yeah, this is a good start. In regards to a couple of things, so cropping, I would definitely look at the dataset tool library. I know Adi was just working with it, and that's like a really simple way to just crop a bunch of stuff. Another thing I might mention for you is because these are more abstract shapes, and because you're also like, you don't have a ton of images just yet, you could also think about things like rotation or mirroring. So a common technique is to rotate stuff if you can, right? So like some of these have like a clear, like what is top and what is bottom. But some of these are more abstract and you could think about rotating those to give yourself a little bit more data.
Cool.
Another thing to think about that I've sort of been learning is a technique that is working better and better. Actually, so the folks who made StyleGAN just released a paper this week on how to train on smaller data sets, which is awesome. Like it's probably going to like change a lot of the work that we do, or like make it a lot easier for us. One of the things they recommend is actually doing some scaling as well as some other things. So basically a thing you could do is you could take this image, and if you brought it into Photoshop, you could actually like make the scale a little bit smaller and then pad the sides with this background color. So you might have like a small, medium, and large sort of scale for this stuff. And that like, it can't totally replace having like a bigger data set, but it can sort of help massage really small data sets better. So that's one of the things about, you do that plus rotation, plus like maybe, I don't know, like part of the question I have with your data set is like, would you be okay with some crops on these shapes? Or would you, do you always want them to be like fully flat background colors, like those sort of things? So then you could also think about like, can I do some cropping, some creative cropping to get different sort of shapes and other things out of it? Yeah, so like I would probably say like try to find, you know, some more images of a similar style, and then doing some of these techniques. So for example, one of the things, I'm just going to quickly grab one of these images and then sort of show you how I would manipulate them in like Photoshop. Like let's grab this one really quickly. So yeah, so I think like manual labor is definitely a part of this of these sort of projects. If you have access to Photoshop, that is like hands down one of the things I recommend messing with. Of course, I don't have it open yet. So once this opens, it's going to take a minute. Tools that are your like sort of your friends are the what is this called? The spot heal brush. Yeah, so the spot heal brush is really helpful. And also the, so like what I might recommend doing is, you know, with an image like this, you could just come around here and just grab these outside edges. And I am like not the world's best Photoshop person, so I kind of hack it. And then you would just like invert the selection here. Inverse, there we go. So now I just have just this background, right? So I would recommend checking out Content Aware Fill, which does a nice job of just sort of like, it takes the shapes and it starts to like figure out how to blend things, right? So like you can see already I was able to take that background color, and even if that background color isn't fully, like it might not actually be a solid color, like if you just use a solid fill, it might fill in weird ways. Ways to remove, I definitely do recommend removing text unless text is a part of your project, because it does tend to lead to like some artifacting and those sort of things. So if you use the healing brush, you can come in and clean up some of these weird like little, you know, pixelations. Now, sometimes it does, we can introduce other shapes. Maybe that's helpful, maybe that isn't. But then, like I mentioned, like the other thing I would recommend doing is if you make your canvas a little bit larger, that's probably really large and maybe too large, but you could even do this and then use context aware fill again, or content aware fill. So now you've got a scaled down version in addition to your other version. Because your images are scraped from the internet, they might be different sizes. Like I think this one was like 500 by 800 when you started. You might want to look at doing some up-resing. So Photoshop now has some new tools that actually have built in, they actually have a machine learning model in here that does resolution changes. So there's Preserve Details 2.0, which is actually a machine learning model. And I think you can turn this on in your settings if you go to preferences, and so there's some like advanced, Google it, or like I'll find how to do it. And this could actually help you res up your images a little bit better than just their traditional thing. So if you like want to make this a little bit larger, like let's say 2000, res that up and then crop it down to a different size. You know, you'll get some like decent resolution images out of this. So this is sort of, depending on your data set, like these are the types of things that I would play with. Just using those tools and, you know, massaging your data set a little bit more. Yeah, so I think like, is that helpful? Is that like helpful to understand a little bit more about? Cool, all right, awesome.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted.
No,
yes.
All good. Yeah, and then I think like the Matisse style seems like it's kind of like, I wonder if it's also like you just do this and you find a couple other, like this might find some, you might find some other artists that are worth grabbing stuff from or whatever. So yeah, like you can probably find some additional pieces just doing that. In this case, it's just like, you probably know the style you need and you just need to figure out how to find more of that data. So cool. Sorry for the behind me. Any other data set questions, or do people want to share their data sets? As always, like you're welcome to, I know a couple people have already reached out to me and just said like, hey, I want to work on this. Like, how would I go about scraping this? Or I didn't really look at, I didn't show in class the pin down materials, but it is, let me just really quickly walk through like how to do pin down, because it is pretty straightforward. The only thing that's annoying about pin down is you have to pay them $2 a month to use this tool. But it is kind of helpful once it's actually there. So one thing that I did the other day was just like typed in textures, and it gives you like a pretty decent like repository of just textures. So once you've installed the pin down little tool, and I'll post the link in it in our Slack channel so people can find it. Once you install it, all you have to do is just hit this little button up here in Google Chrome. I don't really know what the scaling thing does. But basically from here, you can just save all these images. So you just quickly click like, I guess the Let's Rock button, it's weird. And then it's just gonna start downloading all these. So it'll download all these images into some folder. So it's pretty quick. I mean, honestly, it's kind of worth the $2 if you're gonna use this more often. And I assume there's a way to like cancel your subscription or whatever inside of Google Chrome. But this is like a nice way to like quickly grab a bunch of images. And then the thing I like about, using Pinterest is that, let's say I really like, in particular, I really like, this like geometric black and white sort of image. Pinterest has this nice sort of visual similarity library, which again is really helpful for stuff like data sets. Because it is sort of visually similar, you can start to grab things. So maybe you want to do a whole thing of just black and white textures. You could use Pinterest to sort of do some of that work. So it's definitely a good way to work, and it requires no installation of code, which is kind of nice. So if you are sort of like stuck on the installing Python scripts and those sort of things, the pin down tool might be interesting to you. Any other questions, thoughts? All right, well, with that then, I'm gonna go ahead and we can start looking at this week's lecture, and then we'll jump into training. All right, so GANs. So we're gonna talk a little bit what GANs are. You've probably heard me use StyleGAN, Big GAN. I don't know if there's other GANs inside of Runway, but those are probably the two big ones that a lot of people know about. So when you hear someone refer to something as a GAN, that stands for Generative Adversarial Network. So in this, we obviously know what a network is. A network is our machine learning model. It's a structure and architecture to make models out of. The two things you might not be aware of are the generative and the adversarial. Generative means it creates images, right? So we have classification models, or what we would call discriminator models. And those are things like if I hold up an apple to my phone or whatever, it should say this is an apple, right? So that's a case of a discriminative model. Generative means we feed it data and it's able to generate new images or new data from the data sets we give it. And the adversarial part, we're going to talk about that in a minute. That's basically how these things train. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the way I describe this is using sort of this metaphor of there are actually two machine learning models inside of every GAN. There's the generator and the discriminator. And these two essentially play a game with each other. So the way that it works is the generator, taking the data set that you provided it, tries to generate images based on that data set. The discriminator's job is to say whether it thinks that image is real or fake. And when they start with a very like, very lo-fi or like very like grubby sort of images. So both of these start out sort of unintelligent. And they just learn little details. And basically what happens is as the generator sends images to the discriminator and the discriminator says, hey, I think that's fake or that's a real image, the generator learns how to generate better images. And then as the generator sort of fools the discriminator, you let the discriminator know, hey, this was a fake image, you got tricked, then the discriminator gets smarter as well. So it's sort of this like cat and mouse game where these two things get smarter and smarter by playing a game with each other. So the metaphor people usually use with this is a counterfeiter and a bank teller. So in the case of sort of trying to create counterfeit bills to fool a bank teller, it starts out like very dumb and very bad looking like this, right? Like you and I know this clearly isn't a dollar bill, but the sort of stupid or unintelligent discriminator says, yeah, that's close enough to look like a dollar bill. So it accepts it, it says, yes, it's a real image. And then it finds out from its boss, like, hey, that was a fake dollar bill. You can't do that. Like, you're gonna lose a lot of money if you keep doing this. So it gets smarter, right? So the next time the counterfeiter decides, oh, I need to like add some color to it. So that way it's gonna like fake out the bank teller this time. Over the process of this, it gets smarter. So now we have an image that has some like almost photorealistic renderings, those sort of things, to a place where like it almost looks like it could be a dollar bill, right? Like if you flash this in front of someone, it could look pretty realistic. Now the truth is, like, in very rare circumstances does it get to like almost full realism where it feels like it is so perfect that like even the human it can't tell the difference, right? But it gets to a place where it feels really, really close. Or again, if you were to sort of like quickly look at something, you might be fooled by it. So that's the process of training a GAN essentially. So that's what we're going to do when we're going to train our own StyleGAN model. So as I mentioned, there are many ways you can train these models. Most people train them on like big hardcore servers on like some like Google Cloud or AWS, if you've heard of those things. Runway has its own training option. And sometimes people are asking like, well, should I use Runway? Should I use other things? So here's why I think Runway is a powerful like tool. As many of you know, like you are not coders and you don't want to be building things using the command line. So Runway's GUI makes a lot of this really easy. I'll also say that Runway is a little bit faster than like a traditional process. A lot of the things that I train take days. Runway can do it in a couple hours. There's a couple reasons for that. I think a lot of it's just they are spinning up multiple servers behind the scenes to do some of this work. I also find that like Runway, for what it is fairly affordable. It's still pretty expensive, and we'll talk about the prices in just a minute. But it is fairly affordable compared to other services. It may be that because Runway as a startup is like okay with losing some money to get people like hooked on this process. I think there also are some tricks they're doing to make things run a little bit faster. So, but in general, like when people ask about pricing, if you're thinking purely on price, like Runway is actually a good deal, which is kind of surprising when you think about it, because Runway for other tools is not a good deal. Like at 5 cents a minute, that can be pretty expensive. But in this case, it actually is fairly affordable. The downsides to training inside Runway are you get a lot less control. So in some of my other classes where I teach doing StyleGAN training directly on a server, you have way more options you can control, whether it's manually doing mirroring or flipping or rotating of images, control of size, control of different parameters. You don't get any of that inside of Runway, or very little of it at this point. We now do have StyleGAN models that can do non-square, so they can do rectangles of different proportions. Inside Runway, you can only do square models. So that's just something to be aware of, that if you do eventually want to do like something that's more rectangular, there's ways to sort of do it in Runway, right? Which is like you could generate a rectangular image and just stretch it to square, or like add borders, and then you crop it back down when you want to do it. But that can be a little wasteful in terms of processing power. But in general, like square is usually fine, and it's good to start with some of the Runway models that exist. We'll talk about what PKL is. That stands for pickle. Those are the files that you get out of your model when it's done. There's less options inside Runway. So again, as a part of this control thing, they sort of have like automatically like figured out what they think are the best pickles for you to download. And you will have less options there. So when we talk about training, we'll talk about steps and how many steps you're training the model for. Runway lets you download a pickle per every 500 steps, which is decent, but still like those are pretty big jumps. And we'll look at a little bit of like where that might be problematic in the future. But you sort of are just handed those options. They also will, I think you have about 2 weeks after training something that you can download all of your pickles. Otherwise, the latest one, or the one that you set to your default, is sort of what they keep, and they throw the rest away. So if you are really interested in all these various steps of your model, I highly recommend that you download each step as soon as you're done with it, so that you can keep them to use later. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. For most of us, that probably won't be a big issue. But if you are a bit of someone who wants a lot of controls, or a lot of little, like you want to own all of the little pieces, it's something to remember that they will remove all your pickle options except your default after 14 days. Okay, so I made this announcement in Slack last week or the week before. It used to be that Runway gave you a free training for your very first time. They've since eliminated that. So now, in order to train, you do need a creator plan. So as I mentioned, like unfortunately, because of the way that like this class is set up, I can't cover that. And I don't think your credits will work toward it either. So like if you are interested in training, you will need a creator plan. Because I know this class is already fairly expensive, if the $15 or $20 a month that a creator plan costs is like an issue for you, just let me know. I do have some extra credits, and I can do training on my end for you. So just be aware of that. Now, in addition to that monthly plan, there is still also a cost to just do training in general. So it is half a cent a step. And we'll talk about what that is when we get to steps. But in general, you're going to train for anywhere from 3,000 steps to 6,000 steps. So that is like $20 to $50, like in a range. So training is not cheap. but this is still fairly affordable compared to other services that do training for you. But just be aware that there is some cost. So again, as a part of the $100 that you all have as a part of this class, that will work for your training steps. So I don't think you can use the credits toward your monthly plan, but you can use those credits toward training your actual model. One thing that's nice about the creator plan is when you do like the $15 or $20 a month, you get something like 10 or 20% of your, then when you buy credits, you get 10 or 20% as a bonus. So it's sort of like the MTA train where you like will get extra credits for paying a certain flat fee. So if you do find that you get really into training, I do actually think a creator plan is like a fairly good deal. And they're pretty flexible, so you can actually cancel after a month and they don't like make you jump through a million hoops. So I'd say for this class, if you want to do a couple of trainings, like more than one, I would recommend signing up for a creator plan. If you don't want to do more than one and you're just like, I just really want to kind of make a model and see what happens, let me know and I can always do training on my end for you. I'll do like one for everyone if they're interested in that, but after that, I would recommend you sign up for a plan to do your own training. So the steps to training your model, and we'll go through a whole demo of this after the second half of class. But the steps for this are essentially, in Runway, you want to upload your data set. So I've got my bone data set that I'm going to upload to Runway. You can do some pre-processing inside of Runway. So you don't have to use the dataset tools library that I've provided our videos for. You can do some cropping directly inside of Runway, and we'll look at a little bit of that. The downside is that it's pretty limited. It can like crop things, but I'd also say that even when you're cropping things, you don't necessarily know what it's actually going to do behind the scenes when it actually processes that. So sometimes people will crop stuff to rectangles and it will still scale things up and crop them to square. So you kind of have to be aware of what it's doing in order to know what you're doing when you're playing with that. We'll look at that as we go through the demo, but just be aware that like their pre-processing tools are not as fine-tuned as like mine. And in addition, like if you really want to have total control, cropping every image inside of Photoshop is an option, but like it's a little overkill, but like you can do it if you wanted to. Third, we're going to talk about transfer models in a little bit, but there's a thing of you are transferring your model from a already produced model and adding on top of it. That sounds a little crazy right now. I'll explain it all in a minute, but basically you do want to pick a transfer model, and you pick those based on resolution. So I'll look through this, but there are different resolutions that you can train a model to. There's 1024, there's 512, there's 256. There are some rectangular models, but those are pretty rare and usually pretty small. My general recommendation is to do the 1024 by 1024. We're artists, we want some good resolution images, but it's sort of up to you depending on what your data set has or like speed or cost or other things. And we'll talk about a little bit of that. And then you're going to choose your length. That's how many steps you're going. And then we're going to talk about, then you're going to hit train. And then you're going to check on your model like every hour or so. Training for like something like 6,000 steps usually takes about 8 hours. So it isn't the fastest process in the world, but it's still a lot faster than other times, other types of training that you can do outside of Runway. So this is still pretty fast. This is one of those cases where like lots of people on their first training, they just sit there and watch it for 3 hours. And you can totally do that. That's fine. But like, it's kind of like, what is it? The watch pot never boils. It's like that. Like you'll sit there and like stare at it and be like, is it done yet? Is it done yet? Is it done yet? And it will not be done yet. So like, I now just like set it to train and I like go to bed and like come back and check on it the next morning. And then testing. We'll talk a little bit about like actually generating images today, and we'll go into it way more next week. But essentially, like after you've trained your model, you want to test your model by generating some images and see how it works. All right, so screens. I'll do a full demo after our break, but just to sort of walk you through the steps we're going to do going forward. This is the Runway interface where you will be sort of uploading your data set. You just click this little blue button, you upload your data set. This is where I recommend that your images be JPEGs. If your images are PNGs, they're going to be like 3 or 4 times the size, and uploading is going to be really slow. I've personally found that high quality JPEGs work just as fine as PNGs. So there is a tool in the dataset tools library. If anyone's interested, you can just run your dataset tool, and then there's an argument at the end that adds a file extension of JPEG. So that's usually what I do for the last step. So you're gonna upload your images. You'll see here like it's uploading. It takes a little bit of time. So it does take depending on how big your data set is, can take 10 minutes to an hour to upload your data set. This is sort of the step of pre-processing. Again, I'll go through this in a little bit more of a demo, but you'll see here's some images. And you've got some really basic tools here. Right? You've got a center crop. You've got auto crop, which is actually an ML model that tries to figure out what the best crops are of your images. This one's a little tricky. I don't necessarily recommend using it unless you're like just really interested in seeing what it does. There's also a random crop, and there's also a delete. So you can delete images. So again, if you were to scrape Instagram and just pull them all the way into Runway, you could do all your pre-processing in Runway, but I think it would be pretty slow. But it's a possibility if you're interested. Once you've done that, and once you're like pretty much set to go with your data set, you'll be coming here, and these will be your training options. So at the top here is which version of the model you want to use. StyleGAN1 is the older version of the model. StyleGAN2 is the newest updated version. For most people, I recommend StyleGAN2. The only reason you might want to use StyleGAN1 is if you have a 512 by 512 model and you really need that resolution for whatever reason. But the quality of StyleGAN1 is like not as good as StyleGAN2. So just, I would recommend if you're not sure, just pick StyleGAN2. Over here on the right-hand side is how many training steps you're going to use. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but 3,000 is like, I would say sort of bare minimum. I would generally recommend that people train for about 6,000 steps. You'll get a little bit of a nicer quality, and we'll look at that in a minute on what that means and how to sort of tell that difference. But I would generally recommend for your first training to choose like 5,000 or 6,000 steps. Another thing that I might talk about at the end of class is that you can train for 5,000 steps, and if it's not good enough yet, you can train for more time after that by just continuing your training. So don't be like, oh, if it's not great at 5,000 steps, I'm gonna need to train it from scratch again at 10,000 steps. It's not really how it works. You can build on top of each other. So even if you under train, you can always like keep training on top of it. So don't worry about that too much. You're more likely to under train than you are to overtrain. But again, because of this process, we can sort of work on that. This is where you choose sort of what model you're building off of. We'll look at this a little bit more in detail when we actually get to the demo. One thing to note is that if you have previous trainings, you also can train directly from those again. So this is where you could continue training, or you could just like do weird stuff on top of your old trained models. I'll show some examples of that in a minute. But yeah, you'll pick from these. And the thing that's really important that I always try to remind people is like, you might be like, oh, we're doing a thing of like dogs. Should I train from cats? And the answer is like, in an ideal world, yes, you would train dogs from cats because they're both furry animals. The downside is if you want 1024 by 1024 dogs, you can't do that with the cats model because the cats model here you'll see is 256 by 256. So I generally recommend that you pick by resolution. So that means these face models are going to be the highest resolution. They're going to be 1024 by 1024. So in most cases, I'll recommend you pick this just because it's a little bit better. You'll see here the cars model is 512 by 384. So there are some rectangular models if you want to train off these, but you can't control the resolution as easily. There is a nice little interface that shows you how much this stuff is going to cost. So you will see 3,000 steps is always going to cost you $15. One really, really important thing to note here is if you have $10 in credits, but you are going to train for a $15 run, when you hit $10, it will turn off your machine and it will stop training. So whatever you do, make sure that you have more credits in your account than you are training for. In most cases, this won't break anything. It just means you'll undertrain. And in some rare cases, you may be like let's say you train it for, it trains for 3,400 steps and then it shuts off your machine. It might go back to that 3,000 step model, and that's what you have to work with. So you might like lose a little money just in that case. But in general, the rule of thumb is just like make sure you have enough money in your account to like cover your training because some funky things can happen otherwise. Then you're gonna go through the process of training. Runway has this really nice interface of where as it's training, it's going to show you sort of like the most updated sort of images that it's producing. This will sort of show you some really weird horror show images as we go through it, but it will still be like kind of interesting just to watch it change over time. Along the right-hand side here is it's going to tell you a little bit of info just about your model. It's going to tell you while it's training. It's going to tell you how many steps along you are. So like this was an example of a 6,000 step training, and we're only 122 steps in. So it's very, very early, which is why you see that this is mostly faces, because it's training off that face model. It'll give you an ETA for time. I have found that it's the right ETA for StyleGAN1 and the wrong ETA for StyleGAN2. So just know it's like always plus or minus a couple hours. And lastly is a thing called FID score, which I don't talk about too much in this class, but like an FID score is meant to tell you how realistic or how good your model is. But depending on what you upload, that's not really true. So like, don't worry too much with the FID score. Like I've seen a lot of people in Runway Slack or in other places have been like, my FID score is stuck at 50. How do I get it lower? And for a lot of reasons, like FID scores are at best a like guess, or at best like just a like a value to reference, but not a value to like worry too much about. Especially if you're doing stuff like abstract imagery, the FID score will never be accurate for like what you're doing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the techniques that are going to happen while we do this. So we're going to look at transfer learning. So transfer learning is a way that saves us a ton of time. It saves us weeks of training time. We take a model that already exists and we just say, hey, based on all the stuff you've learned already on that model, learn a little bit of new stuff with my new data set. So here's an example of what transfer learning looks like. So you'll see where it starts with this like really like sort of horrendous looking, these very weird looking images of like half faces, half abstract imagery, because that's what the data set was, right? It always starts, so if you use whatever your transfer learning model is, like this is the high resolution 1024 by 1024 faces, it always starts with faces. So like, don't be shocked if like, you're like, did I upload the wrong data set? Like what happened here? It always starts with whatever you're starting to train from. And over time, let's say this is maybe 500 steps. So over time, it's going to like sort of begin to eliminate these things. Now, this is a thing that some people exploit, right? Some people want just these weird horror show images, and they want just the 500 steps in of their model. Now, you can work with this. You can generate images off of this or whatever it is. You could then also take another model or like say cars or cats and do these similar things with it. So these are options. You can download these models directly within Runway and play with them. But most of us want like what is realistically like this middle level, which are like these nice abstract shapes, or maybe even a little bit further along, which are like even better generated. So as this thing changes over time, you'll see it starts to get better and better, right? The training becomes more accurate to my data set. And this is the point of training, is that over time it learns more and more features and it gets better and better. This is probably trained for 6,000 steps, maybe 8,000 steps. If you were to train this again for longer on top of this model, it would start with this very last image, right? So it'd start with this image here. Oops. All right, so it'd start with one of these, and then it would keep training off of that, and it would get better and better over time. Now, the truth is it's never gonna get to like full realism or like the full data set because again of that, that GAN training, right? It might, depending on your data set and depending on the type of images you use, it might not ever be able to learn perfect images. And that's kind of good, right? Because otherwise we would just use the photography we already have to like make images out of. So this is kind of the fun of generating stuff in StyleGAN, is you don't really know what you're gonna get. So I think I showed this example last week, which is like, this was like some very hard edge geometrics work from Aris Benjamin Buckler. When you stick it into a GAN model, it gets very like morphy and like kind of like the colors become gradients rather than flat colors. Like this is the nice part of like StyleGAN, right? It's not just reproducing the exact same image I previously saw. So I mentioned already, FID scores don't matter. If you're interested in learning more about FID scores, I have some like very mathy papers about how FID works. But essentially FID has been trained on, we talked about this last week actually, it's called ImageNet, which is a large repository of images of plants, animals, and objects. So it tries to match your images to those objects. So again, if you have really abstract stuff, your FID score will never be good. Whereas if you have something like, say, like a cat, like if your data set is all cats, FID scores might be more accurate for what you're doing there. Point blank, like the thing is, use it as reference, but don't worry about what your actual score is in the end. Like you want your score to go lower. So basically it'll always start at like 300. you want your score to like get lower, and the lower it gets, the more realistic it likely is. But you don't need to worry about it too much. And like, especially for runway and art stuff, it's like really not that big of a deal. So there are a couple of things to watch out for when you're training. I personally have found these do not happen very often inside a runway, but just in case you might see these things, so let's talk about them. Okay, so the first is called overfitting. Overfitting is basically what happens is that this usually happens because of a small data set or something, but basically your images just seem to reproduce exactly what you trained it on. So it basically will just create copies of your images. So this is basically what's happening is the model's memorizing your images. And we talk about this as what we want models to do is generalize, right? So be able to say like, oh, some faces have black hair, some faces have green eyes, some faces have mustaches or beards or other things. But like, you don't want to say like, this face always has to have black hair, blue eyes, and a beard. That is memorization. We want more of a generalization. So here's an example of what you might see overfitting to look like. So I trained this on a very small data set of product images from Amazon. And one of the ways you can sort of tell that a model is overfitting is if you look at a grid of these images or whatever, you'll see that like many of them look the exact same, right? So if you look at this laptop, this one and this one and this one and these two all look pretty much the exact same. And for this many images, it should be more diverse than that. Or in the case of like these TVs, like you always get this TV and it's either like, you can see it like learns it memorizes mirroring, right? So sometimes the panel is on the left or sometimes the panel is on the right, but it's like pretty much the same image. This is one way to tell overfitting. Another really easy way to tell overfitting is when you do a latent space animation. See how this one jumps? There's no like seamless transition. It just jumps between things. That means it's basically memorized stuff. I will say I rarely see this inside of runway models. And I think Runway has done some stuff to sort of prevent overfitting a little bit. But if you compare like this thing on the right, which is like a very smooth interpolation to this overfit model on the left, you'll see how different they are. So that's overfitting. That is one thing that could happen. Usually this happens because you have a very, very small data set. So if you have 50 images, 100 images, maybe 200 images, you will get, are more likely to get overfitting. So this is why I tend to push people to try to find as many images as they can, because you don't really want overfitting. I mean, the problem with overfitting is that, you know, most of us want to create these cool like interpolation videos, right? And clearly if it skips around a lot, it's like not really going to be that interesting. The other downside is like, you may actually like what these images look like, right? Like I might like that this is like a really weird looking TV or whatever. But let's say like I can really only produce, I don't know, maybe 40 images out of this data set. And the problem with that is like, I spent $50 making this data set and I only get 40 images out of it, right? So it's kind of like a low return. So again, some people you might just want to play with it and like do it and just make some weird, it's almost like a Photoshop filter. But I'd say like bang for your buck is like, you want to avoid overfitting. The next thing you might see happen is what's called mode collapse. And mode collapse is actually like there's also folks that will call this explosions. These are a little bit harder to diagnose, but it's like one of those things where like you kind of know it when you see it. So what happens here? So what happens here is that this is when the generator finds a couple of solutions that fool the discriminator. So again, we talked about that GAN training, right? So like the idea is that you want many, many different types of faces that will fool the discriminator. But let's say the model, for whatever reason, finds out that like, oh, if I always show a face with blonde hair, green eyes, and you know, red lipstick, that always fools the discriminator, and it just constantly relearns that over and over again. That's kind of an example of mode collapse. That sounds like really nice, or like that sounds fine. The truth is what mode collapse ends up looking like in StyleGAN is this. So it doesn't even look like the data set of images you provided. It just almost looks like explosions of like weird textures. And the thing you can kind of see here is like if I uploaded a ton of different imagery, I really only see like the same image just distorted in different ways, right? So it's this like reddish with greenish background. But this again has like there's no diversity in these images, or like there's very little diversity in these images. And again, if you look at the interpolation video from this, you'll see it does this bouncing thing. It like doesn't have a smooth interpolation. It just bounces between things. And here again, like these textures are cool. Like when I show these to my friends, like this looks really awesome. This looks amazing. But the truth is, like, again, I get very limited data out of the source that I provided it, right? And this clearly doesn't look like flowers. I fed it a training data set of flowers and other things. I just never really did anything with it. So here again, like it sometimes produces really interesting art, but like it's not the ideal scenario for us, and the return on investment is kind of low. So unfortunately, there's really no way to fix a mode collapse or an explosion. There are ways you can retrain it from a previous step, but there's no real way to get out of it. This is like one of the circumstances that happen, I would say, fairly often to GANs. I also generally don't see this in Runway particularly often, in part because I think what they've done is they've sort of done, there's some parameters you can manage to sort of make this happen less often. But I have seen it happen sometimes in GANs on Runway. So just be aware that this is a possibility. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about how to decide which one of your iterations is good. So a lot of people will come to me and they'll say, okay, I did this training and here are my images, and I want to pick my favorites, right? So it's like, I really, really like the colors in this one. I really like, you know, the shape of this one and the shape of these. So like, I should clearly just pick 2260, right? And unfortunately, like that's not how I recommend working on it. So in these images, these are what were called fakes. This is a grid of, what is this? This is 4 by 7. So this is 30 images. These are 30 images representative of an entire model that could have millions of images in it. One thing I recommend is like, first off, like don't look every 100 steps and try to determine like, do I like 2260? Do I like 2350? That's like too narrow of a set. And then secondly, like these images are just representations. So that because you like this one image, that might not mean the rest of the model is good. So in general, what I do is, yeah, don't do this. Don't do this process of like these really small steps between things. I'll look at much wider steps, right? So every 1,000 steps, every 2,000 steps. And then you want to pick between these. So again, remember also that Runway in particular only gives you access to every 500 steps. So you can only download like at 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000 or maybe 5,500. So you can't even really pick between those fine-tuned settings. But on top of that, like this is way clearer about like how different the data set is, right? So here it's like very, very much textures. You might even still be able to see a little bit of the faces in here. Whereas this very last step is far less texture and more like individual shapes, more backgrounds. This looks more like the Freya Buckler art, which is maybe what I want. But it also might just be like, no, I like a little bit of this abstraction. I like a little bit more of the texture in here. So if you look at stuff, you know, every 1,000 steps, every 500 steps, you'll have a much better way of sort of telling like what model I want to work from. So it's important to know that like, this is how I recommend looking at this, because if you really go through every individual like slider step, you'll drive yourself insane trying to figure out what the best one is. Yeah, and just remember these are samples. So like, I still would recommend like you actually generate a video or other things to like figure out like what the interpolation looks like or what the rest of the space looks like. Because as we've seen, there are so many images in these sets that like just these 30 here are not representative of the entire data set. All right, so we are at 8 o'clock. So why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then I'll actually walk through how to do this inside Runway. And if you have questions, we can catch them after the break as well. So why don't we come back at 5 after? Cool. All right, see everybody in 5 minutes. Record again here, and we get started. So any questions based on everything I showed you just yet? I will walk through like a full demo of how to do training, but I'm interested to hear if there's any immediate questions. No. Anton?
Oh, yeah. So when you're setting up the training model in Runway, you're always using StyleGAN2, it sounds like, and then you're also going right into faces.
Yeah, that's usually my default for folks.
Okay, cool.
The only time you really wouldn't want to do that is like, let's say, I don't know, let's say for whatever reason you really only have images that are 256 by 256 or smaller or whatever. It's important to know that, and we'll look at that in a minute, but Runway does upsize or upres your images to whatever size the model is. So if you're uploading really small images to your data set and then choosing the 1024, it will upres all your images, which means you're gonna get a lot of blurriness in your data set. So yeah, that's why like I sort of say like try to scrape Instagram because it has lots of like decent sized images, analyze square images. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay, cool. Well, let's jump into just actually looking at how to do training inside of Runway. Okay, so when you're in Runway, the first time you open the interface, there's obviously the browse models, open workspaces, or train a model. So let's go ahead and jump right into training a model. So we're gonna click on train model. And then, so you'll see here that you have the train a new image model, train a new text model. We're gonna go ahead and obviously choose the train image model. First thing I'll ask is just to give it a name. So we're just gonna give it a name of SSHH test, hit create. So I have a bunch of data sets already in here. These are things that I've uploaded or used before. Obviously, for most of you, you'll probably see down here that they just have a couple default data sets, right? So mountains, airplanes, graffiti, forests, skyscrapers, caterpillars, and nebulas. So you can use any of these if you want to. I don't know, it's kind of a waste of your money to train a model that someone's already built, but if you want to just play with it, you can. So those exist. I've already uploaded my bone model here, but I'm just going to go ahead and show you how you would upload this anyway. You're just going to go ahead and click the little plus icon. You then go ahead and choose your folder. So I'm going to choose, let me just choose this one for now. So these were JPEGs. So you'll see that like, you know, it's uploading. It's not the fastest thing. It's basically compressing stuff and it's going to upload this. It's about 1,000 images for this data set. So, you know, it's definitely not the fastest thing in the world, right? You'll see it's moving pretty slowly. That's all you have to do. So you can take a raw data set, a new data set, whatever, and upload it. I'm just going to skip ahead and just choose this one that I've already pre-uploaded. So this is actually, I'm going to come in here and actually rename this. I'll name it bone. So along the left, along the right-hand side here, you will see like once you've selected your data set, there is a pre-processed data set button. So if you click this, come on, there we go. This is that interface that I showed you how to crop images. So the downside of this is you can kind of see it's a little slow. It's definitely uploading, you know, loading in these images. But if I wanted to come in here and just do like random crop, and I want to just really like a really tight crop on Bone's face, I could do that. Oops, what's going on here? There we go. Oh, there. Okay, so I could come in here and I could just like say I want just, you know, a really tight crop on Bone's face. Random. Yeah. So this will let you sort of move stuff around a little bit if you want to. It seems like it's still, I don't know, maybe the interface is acting a little wonky. You can do rectangle crops here. The downside is that no matter what, even if you give it a rectangular crop, it's actually going to crop it to square because of the data set. Or I guess like when you choose your data set, it will figure out what to crop it to. So if you use that cars model, which is rectangular, it'll crop to those models, to those shapes anyway. It's usually why I recommend doing your pre-processing outside of Runway, just because you have a little bit more control over it. So once you're done with one of these, you just hit the check button. That's going to just add this to your cropped images. You can also just grab a bunch of these. I think you can do this. This interface is really slow right now. You can grab a bunch of these just using this button, and you could say like auto crop all of them. I won't do this because it's going to probably like hang up my computer. But you could go in here and just look at a bunch of them and say just auto crop them all. And then you could look at your results once that's done. So actually, let me just grab, you can grab a handful of these. Let's see. Doesn't look like I can grab a handful this way. So you can only just grab all of them at once by using that button here. And then you can select different crops. You can remove stuff. So like, let's say I get really far into this. Man, come on. Let's say I find that like I missed an image as I was like doing it. I probably did a better job of curating this than I thought I did. But if I find a bad image, you can just remove it. And that's just going to remove it. Once you're done, you can hit submit, and that's just going to save out all your new batch of images. Since I already did this outside of here, I'm just going to hit close and skip the pre-process step of this. So once you're done with this, you just want to click next. And here's where you choose your training options. So again, you'll see StyleGAN1 is generating photorealistic images. They say for StyleGAN2, it's improvements of image quality and variety. So I generally would recommend you use this one. The downside is that StyleGAN2 does train a little bit slower, but because they charge you for steps and not for length of time, it's kind of fine. I have found you usually have to train for a little bit more in steps as well, which is why I generally recommend like 5,000 steps or 6,000 steps for these rather than the 3,000. For here, you are going to pick a pre-trained model. If you don't want to do faces, what you do is you just click the change button down here, and then you scroll and you'll see there are a number of options here. There's cats, cars. Also, all of your previously trained models of recent era will also show up in here. I've got models from like months ago that I think they've sort of archived, but recent like newish models will also show up in here. So if you wanted to like take one of your previous trainings and continue it further, you could from here. I'm just going to use faces for now, and that should be fine. Next is how many training steps do I want to set. So I'm going to set this, I would set this for like 5,000 or 6,000. You can also click this little button here that says estimated cost. It tells you how much it's going to cost you, right? So a 6,000 step model is going to cost 30 bucks. Make sure you have enough credits, that sort of thing. You can buy credits directly from there. I'm actually just going to set this to 2,000 in part because I've already trained this model. So I'm just going to show you how that works. Actually, let's set it even lower. Let's set it to 1,000. So I'll just show you the example I've already trained, and then we'll come back to it. But for this, you're just going to hit start training. Now this is training. It does take a couple minutes to get spun up. So again, behind the scenes, they are spinning up a server for you and then installing a bunch of software and then actually doing the training. So it usually takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes for this thing to start. So in general, what I'll do is I'll like just hit start and then I'll come back and look at it in a couple minutes. There are some rare cases where this will have crashed or like something will have gone wrong and not installed correctly. In those cases, what I usually recommend doing is first off, reach out to me. But also I would recommend reaching out to the Runway folks on their Slack channel. Sometimes they are able to debug it and figure it out, but also if you somehow got charged for that time, they'll credit you with it. They're pretty friendly and pretty welcome to help like folks out if something breaks without screwing people over and charging them lots of money. So this is now training. This will take a little bit of time before things get set up. So while this does this, I'm going to jump over to showing you what a finished model looks like. So I ran this one last night. The very last step you'll see is this, hooray, you've trained a model. You will have view my model, add to workspace, and then there's a cool little latent space video that it generates for you. What you're actually going to want to see, like when you go through this, I always click back to training. So if you click up here, you click on training, you will see that this is the interface I sort of showed you before, which is this grid interface. And if you take this along the bottom here and you just scrub it left to right, you'll see here's where it started. So it started with all these pictures of faces. I bet if we go to like the 500 step, we'll get a very weird cat human hybrid. Yep, there's like some weird human cats. And so you can kind of scrub along here and just sort of get a sense of like what this model looked like at every step, right? Now you'll also notice along the right-hand side here as you scroll to each different side, you will get a different FID score. So because this is a cat, I actually do want to know when this was like the lowest score possible. So actually see that it hit 48 here before going back up to 50. That's not really like the end of the world. That slight difference in score probably doesn't really mean too much. But it is helpful to know, like if I had one that was like 20 and then it went back up to like 50, I might actually want to look at that 20% or the score of 20 and try to like work from that model. So this is usually a thing I'll look at. If you want to like that cool video I showed you, which is that progress video, if you want to download one of those, you just click on the create progress video, and this will like, it'll export a little video of this animating. So basically it'll go from here up to here, and it'll give you a little video that you can then upload and show people all the creepy models you've made. So this is usually what I look at. Like I said, I usually now like let this run overnight and I just look at it in the morning. The nice thing about this is that Runway doesn't charge you for this, like isn't on in the sense of how they charge you on a minute per minute basis. This is just running in the background. So you can shut your laptop, you can like quit Runway, you can do whatever. In the background, it's just going to be running this model, and it will email you when it's ready. So you don't need to worry about leaving this on for too long or whatever it is. So usually, like I said, I'll just like set it before I go to bed, come back in the morning, and I'll have a fresh new model to look at. So this is sort of like, hey, this thing is over. Once you've done this, you can come back over here to review. And down here at the bottom is, so basically it defaults to your latest checkpoint, right? So the checkpoint it chose was step 6,000, so it changed it for 6,000 steps. If I want to change that, there we go. You can change your default here by pulling down this menu and then scrolling through your steps. So again, remember that it saves out every 500 steps for you. So you've only got 5,500, 5,000. You've only got these steps available to you. Two things you can do here. One is if you hover over one of these and you see the little ellipses menu here, you click on this, you can download this model. So I would recommend if you're like just sort of a archivist, or you just like to keep everything you work on, download all your models. Remember that after 14 days of completing a training, they will delete all of your other models except the one that's set to default. So basically, like I would probably download all of them in like the day they're finished, play with them a little bit inside of Runway, and then I might pick like maybe like more often than not, it's going to be the last one that you want to set as your default. But for whatever reason, I might want to set this one. Maybe this one is a little bit better, and I could set this as the default. So you can set these as defaults by just clicking on set default and that switch your tag. Now, 14 days from now, it's going to archive the other options except for this one. So just be aware that like whatever you set to your default. So like in general, I would say like don't set step 500 to be your default because you're going to have like kind of lost a lot of your data. Once you download those pickles, there are ways to upload your pickle back in and work from that. It's just, it's a little bit, it's one more step than you would see in Runway. So just be aware of that. I definitely recommend downloading at least a handful of these just so you have access to them. And when you download them, they're just going to download to a folder, and they're going to be a .pkl file. This PKL file, you won't be able to open in anything really. You'll be able to save it into Runway if you want to. But in most parts, like you can't just open this in Photoshop and get images out of it. It's just like, it's math inside of there. So you'll have to save this and use it in either Runway, or like I have other classes to show you what you can open these in a thing like called Colab or on a server or whatever. So setting defaults is important, and also downloading a couple of these is also like really good to know. I'm gonna set the latest one back to my default. Cool. So now you've got view my model or add to workspace. Most of us are probably going to just add these to our workspace. There's a couple options to do from here. You can add this to your workspace, which is just gonna bring up the traditional workspace interface. Over here, you can also save out your latent space video. You can also generate samples. So one thing we could do here is like, let's just say we want to generate like 50 samples. Okay, let me do 20, 50. 50 is the max, or 50 is the minimum. So let's do 50 samples. It's costing 50 cents. And then I can, there we go, generate these. So again, this is a process. I think I talked about exporting in a previous class, but this will just generate these images behind the scenes for you. So again, you don't have to worry about running your model or like turning a machine on or whatever and keeping an eye on it. They're just going to create exports in your export file here, and you'll see this is processing now. So this is now generating these. The nice thing about this is it only costs 1 cent per image. So instead of worrying about how many cents per minute are you dealing with, it's a batched price, and it sort of tells you up front what it's going to cost you. So it's kind of nice in that regard. This will be running. So it'll like ping me in the interface when it's ready to go. So this is one way to look at all your models if you wanted to just generate a bunch of images and sort of see what happens. But another way is just to like go to add workspace. And then this is just like the interface you've always been working with, which is you run this remotely. And then we'll set this to the vector input. So once this is set up here and we're running, this works just like all the other vector input models, right? So remember what your truncation value is sort of a realism model. So point A is pretty large. So if I were to set this to 0.5, so you'll see already like there's lots of like, there's some bone faces here, but then there's some weird textures looking like a very creepy, like, I don't know, like monster version of bone. Bone is too cute to be a monster. So we got to find a way to get better versions here. So I'm gonna set the truncation to 0.5. So these are much more bone looking images. There are still some weird ones for sure, but even the weird ones are looking less monster-like. And then you've got a sampling distance here, right? So I can crank this up and I can just sort of see overall what a bunch of my different images look like. So what I think is really interesting is like, I actually did not expect this to look as good as it did. I think because there are so many selfies of bone, it really knows how to reproduce bone's face. Whereas like when it's trying to produce like body shots, it gets kind of creepy. So here's a case of where like good data will sort of help you. But this is also a case of where like, because I have so many photos of bone's face, it learned the face really well. And then where I didn't have a lot of photos of bone's body, so bone did not turn out as well. It turned out kind of like looking like creepy turtle thing, or like a pine cone of some kind. So this is pretty much like, this is the process for training. And like, it was pretty straightforward. Once you get the hang of it, like the hardest part of any of this stuff is just making the data for it. That is a really weird image of bone. I have to download this one. You know, so this process, like the hardest part is really making the data set. Like hands down, the hardest part of this is making the data set. Once you have it and once you're training it, then it's just kind of fun to be like, what kind of images am I producing? You know, so there is a case here of if I go back to my training, you can continue training. So one really easy way is if you like this image and you just want to keep training a little bit longer, you come up here and you click continue training. And it's going to auto like set up all your settings for you. So it's going to like, I know what data set you're already using. I want to work off this pre-trained model. I want to do StyleGAN2. And then it's like, how long do you want to train it for? So I would say like, let's train it. I'll train it for another 6,000 steps and just sort of see what happens. So I'll set this one up to go. So we'll see how realistic we can get bone's face to be. So this is going to run for a little bit. So I've now got 2 here running. This first one finally get kicked off just recently, right? So I'm at step 10. So it's still learning a lot. You'll see the FID score started at 230. So really high up because obviously human faces don't match cat faces. So it knew the score should be low. Yeah, so this is essentially, this is the steps it takes for training. Any questions based on what I've shown you so far here?
I have one about basically how you trained bone on these faces.
Mm-hmm.
Do you just choose that for anything? Like, does that help train anything, even if it's like more abstract or not lifelike?
Yeah, I mean, the basic answer is you pick the closest thing you have to what you want, either in resolution or in features. So if I had a cat model that was 1024 by 1024, I would, like, let's say I do another data set of like grumpy cat or whatever. I would train off the bone data set for for the grumpy cat data set. Because those features are closer to each other, training should be a little bit quicker. Not too much, but just a little bit. But like, basically you have to choose between resolution and feature set. And in most cases, resolution is actually what really matters the most. So I'll generally pick whatever is the highest resolution I have and the closest thing to it. So I have now built up a bunch of different training sets that are all high res. So I will sort of pick from those sets what I want to train next. But also the faces thing is fine. Like, you know, you could see like when we trained bone, like, let me go back here to training. Like it doesn't really look that much, like it looks pretty good. And we train from faces, right? So it's not really that different. There are some downsides. Like you'll also notice that like these in-between steps, like if you actually scroll backwards, you can kind of see how these images got generated, right? So like, look at this blue and red one right up here in the top corner. And as I scroll through here, like it's finding like a blue or red background for bone, right? So like you can see it's still learning stuff from those previous trainings, but at the end of the day, it like didn't affect the training that much that it was like a negative response. And like, so a lot of people outside of Runway will do training from scratch, and like training from scratch is actually like probably the best, or like you will get the most best resolution results from it. The problem is that it takes you 10 times as long to train. So it's way, like they don't even offer it inside of Runway because it just would be so expensive. It would cost like $100, $150 to train a model from scratch. And it's a long process. So in my experience, like transfer learning like this saves you so much time and effort that it's worth it, even if the results are like just slightly worse. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Yep. Other questions? Okay, so let me show you two other cool features. I think I've touched on this before, but two other nice features of doing these trainings inside of Runway. So we looked at exports in the training interface, which gives you images that you can download. But there's also exports inside of the workspace. And this is a little confusing because it feels like they should be available in both, but they're not. Inside of workspaces, you can also generate latent walks. So remember that one latent walk that it gave us it was the only one that it made available to us. This is going to make a bunch of other latent walks for us. So like, let's say I know I want like some nicer looking bones. So I'm gonna bring my truncation down a little bit. Number of keyframes I want, time between keyframes, and then the frame rate for the video. So this is gonna be a 30-second video at 30 frames per second. And it's gonna generate one of these videos for me. So if I come in here and estimate the cost, you'll see creating one of these videos cost me about 90 cents. So because 900 frames times, oh, I guess it's interesting. It's like 0.1 cent. It's like 1/10 of a cent per frame. So, so you could come in here and generate a bunch of different videos from this. Now, next week, I'm going to show you how to generate latent walk videos with more control, right? Because I don't really have any say over what these keyframes are. Next week, I'm going to show you how to actually like say, I want to use this keyframe, and this keyframe. So those will be, I'll show you how to do that next week. But we just want to generate some random videos for this week. You can come over here and just hit the generate latent walk. The thing is, you must be inside of a workspace to do this. So when you add this to your workspace, you've got the option of generating images, or you've got the option of generating the latent walk. So we hit export. This again will show up inside of your exports folder here. So let's see. So what do we have over here so far? So it looks like all of my videos are done. My progress video is done. So let's take a look at some of the images that we downloaded from here. All right, this also takes a little bit of time. Let's click here. This gives you a zip, and you just open it up, and here are all of our images. So weird cat butt, good cat face, so-so cat face, interesting cat face with like these textures seem to be very like StyleGAN prevalent. I don't know where they come from, but it's interesting. This one's like almost a perfectly rendered cat face in pure abstraction. It's kind of great. Good cat face of the body, a weird loaf cat face. You will just notice there's lots of weird textures. These like weird like fur-like textures. Well, also getting really good, the bone faces are really amazingly well done in many of them. Some of them are totally gnarly looking. I don't even know what this is. Maybe it's like Bone's backpack took over its whole body. I'm definitely not going to share these with Bone's owner because might freak her out. So that's like pretty much the basics of training, and then also how to generate some images and videos really quickly from this. So I hope for this week you'll be able to just sort of like finish up your data set and then do at least one training if you can. because I do find that like different data sets will produce different styles of training. And I actually had a student last time I taught this class who sent me a data set and it was like, is this too diverse? And I was like, I really think it is too diverse. Like it's going to turn into mush. But then she trained it anyway, and she got some really cool results out of it. So, you know, no matter what, like I think the nice thing about Runway is because it's like fairly inexpensive. Like you probably still have a bunch of credits left. If you can generate multiple data sets, you can just throw it at and see what happens, because it trains pretty quickly as well. Whereas like a lot of my other trainings that I do myself are like fairly expensive or in time processes. So I will be a little more careful about training stuff. But I tend to find if I throw stuff inside a Runway and like just see what happens, I get really interesting results, and very often results I never expected. So that's everything I have for class this week. I'm happy to talk about questions, or if you're working through data set stuff, I'm happy to sort of like talk through that if anyone has more they want to talk about. Also, there's like a house party going on right next to me. It's great. It's definitely summer in New York right now. Any questions? Adi?
I had a question. Yeah, so I scraped a couple of Instagram profiles that I wanted to try using, and I did like a little bit of hand selecting, and I had like about 700 images, and then when I started using dataset tools to sort of weed out images by size, basically the data set got really small really quickly.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, is there like a hard limit on, for example, the size of an image that we want to use? Does it have to be 1024? Can we sort of relax that constraint a little bit?
Yeah,
because I imagine that sort of works for most Instagram profiles. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's fine if you want to relax your limit a little bit. So again, for Runway, you can just upload a whole file set of images, and they can be different sizes and different resolutions, and it will sort of do the best it can. So it'll like, if an image is 600 by 600, it'll scale it up to 1024 by 1024. It'll crop it to square, those sort of things. So I would definitely recommend. I am often wrong about how things actually train. So like if you're super like control freak type about this stuff, like you'll be like, oh, I don't want to blow up an image 2x and like it'll get too blurry, right? But the truth is, I don't know. Like we really like, as a computational area of expertise, we are constantly finding out new things about GANs. So I would say just throw it at it and see what happens. I will say more data is better than less data. So if weeding out your data gets you down to 200 images, that's probably not great. If it gets you down to 500, you might be able to get away with it. But it's also worth maybe just doing 2 tests. If you do 2 tests at 3,000 or 5,000 steps, it's like not that expensive, and you'll learn a little bit about what works and what doesn't.
Cool, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, there is this like new paper that just came out from the folks who like built this whole network, and they found that like scaling is a powerful tool to actually help these things learn better. The trade-off is like if you scale up from a small image to a big image and it gets blurry, is it going to introduce blur artifacts, or is it still going to learn stuff? So this paper literally came out like last week. So we're still sort of learning about what works and what doesn't within these systems. And I would expect, so that paper came out last week. They said they're going to release the new version of the model. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this year, Runway is using that new version of the model, and stuff is training a lot better. That's kind of one of the nice things about all these machine learning stuff, is stuff changes so quickly that we might be producing really, really beautiful like stuff with hundreds of with 100 images rather than 1,000 images by this time next year. So it's kind of those things that if you understand how it works, you can like keep up with all the models, and it gets really cool. But yeah, so right now, like, I mean, the thing about, so StyleGAN2 came out, I don't know when it came out, but they upgraded StyleGAN2 maybe in the fall of last year. And like the differences in those 2 formats is so big that I expect again another year we'll have like even better stuff. Like maybe the next time I'll be training a bone data set on StyleGAN3 or whatever, like it won't have these weird like lumps of cat fur. We'll actually be able to get bodies out of them. So it's like a cool thing that like these things are constantly improving. Other questions?
Question, and I might connect with you offline on this on a one-on-one, but
Yeah.
my data set is based off this abstract expressionist artist, and I've done an Instagram scrape. I've been downloading all these images, and some of it is like, it's even hard for me to tell when it's repetitive because the style is very similar. So if when you're training these models, if for some reason you're getting a lot of like similar images or images that are close to each other, will that really affect the model? Because what I would see from what we've just learned is that it's going to push that towards that, where you're going to get more of a repetition of a certain style or a certain thing versus having diverse.
That's a great question. So what I've sort of learned is like, yes, if let's say half your data set is like all of one style, you're going to see that more represented in the model as well. But it should in some ways be proportional, right? So if you have 10% of your data set are all white lines on black backgrounds, the hope is that your model also returns that. So that's, you know, one of the cases where exploring these sort of exploring the spaces and sort of understanding what's in there is really helpful. And I recommend like just playing around with things. Like I actually really recommend just generating a bunch of different videos. If you generate like, let's say 10 videos from your data set, that should give you a pretty good range of like what's going on in there. Change some truncation values, change some other things. Like that should give you a good sense of what's in the model. A lot of times what I have found is like, if you're constantly like sort of seeing the same images, that might mean that your variation is wrong, or you're just looking at like one particular area within the space, right? So again, if we imagine like a cube, if you're only looking in the bottom left-hand corner, you're going to see a lot of similar images. If you're looking in the whole space, you might see like more imagery in those areas. There's another area where like GANs have not really figured out how a lot of this stuff works, right? So like we know how to sort of like check all the different corners, or like maybe just by forcing more and more images to be produced, we can see more of the space. But it's kind of hard to visualize these areas because they are hyperdimensional and like our brains don't work like that. Yeah, so I'd say like your data set will influence it, but hopefully not too much. Like if you have a couple duplicates in your data set, that shouldn't mean your entire model is going to produce those duplicates.
Well, yeah, I was just curious of that. Thanks.
Yeah, no,
I might send it to you too, just to have a quick gander and see what you think. So.
Cool, sounds good. Anyone working on a particular data set they want to ask about or want to show the group? Other people might be able to like, the cool thing I find it, so there is, there's a datasets channel in Slack. I think I might have highlighted this before, but if you come over here into Slack, there's a datasets channel. You're always welcome to just like say like, hey, I want to make more stuff like this. And, you know, maybe people like Judson, maybe more people know about more Matisses or other like artists who are similar, who are working in similar veins, or people might be able to recommend some things. So you're always welcome to sort of jump out of our own channel and just post some stuff. You know, I would say like a lot of people are not necessarily like, no one is, if there are mean people in my Slack channel, I tend to kick them out. Happens very, very rarely. So feel free to post. You might not get responses, or you might get some responses, who knows. Yeah, and I'm also welcome to, I'm happy to help out people if I can. Well, if there's no more questions, we can end class a little bit early. I definitely would recommend hit me up on DM or in the Slack channel if you have questions. Happy to walk through some StyleGAN training if you like are feeling uncomfortable about it, especially about data sets. I'm really, really happy to help folks with that. And I would say like start to think about when you want to schedule your one-on-one with me. I do think now through like the next month or so is a good time. Make sure you don't lose the momentum of working on stuff. But then again, I also know that sometimes work gets crazy and people get busy with things. So if you want to schedule it for a later date, like there's no like expiration date on this stuff. So I'm happy to talk whenever. All right, cool. Well, hopefully it's summer in everyone's area and you can all go out and enjoy a little bit while also socially distancing. And I'll see everybody next week then. Cool.
Thank you,
All right.
Derek. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Take it easy.
Yep. Bye.